And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Sophie, who will be our host tonight, and she will be introducing Jeremy, our speaker. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome again. I'm Sophie. I'm a member of the board of directors for the RPA, and I'll be the host, as Dan said, so I'll be monitoring all of your questions that you ask in the Zoom chat. All of us at the Rensselaer Plateau Alliance are really excited to have you join us for tonight's exciting lecture with Jeremy Hurst. So as you all know, he is here to speak about moose and black bears on the plateau. Jeremy serves as the Big Game Unit Leader for the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation, where he has worked in the Big Game program since 2005. His responsibilities include statewide oversight of the white-tailed deer, black bear, and moose management programs. And then before joining the DEC, Jeremy also researched wintering deer in northern New York, worked on projects with doll sheep, grizzly bears, and small mammals, and even taught high school science in the Dominican Republic. So Jeremy has received his BS in biology from Houghton College and his MS in wildlife biology and management from the SUNY College of Environmental Science and Forestry. So now I'd like to hand it off to Jeremy and we can get started.
Very good. Thank you, Sophie and Dan. And so I just want to welcome you all and on behalf of the Department of Environmental Conservation and myself. And also want to extend a thank you to the Rensselaer Plateau Alliance and to Dan and Sophie for inviting me to participate in this. I wish we could be in person, as it would be much more enjoyable for me to have the interaction with you all. There's the lack of participation and being able to get your feedback throughout the presentation is a little bit harder for me, but of course it's nothing new for any educator or anyone else who in business has had to give presentations remotely like this. So I appreciate your patience with that. As Sophie had mentioned, maybe Dan had mentioned, we'll have opportunity for questions as well. And so in fact, because I'm talking about bear and moose somewhat independently in the presentation, there'll be a natural break. And I threw in a slide midway that we can stop and talk about some questions about black bear before we move on to moose. And so if you just throw up questions in the chat, we can address them then, but hopefully I cover everything and you don't have any questions. So anyhow, thanks for participating with this. As Sophie indicated, I work for the Department of Environmental Conservation as a Big Game Unit Leader and work with a team of biologists across the state in each of our different regional offices that are engaged on the ground in field work related to black bear and moose and white-tailed deer. And so I'm really blessed to have a great team of biologists to work with. We have a biologist in our Schenectady office who oversees some of the bear issues in the Rensselaer Plateau and Rensselaer County area. I'm a resident of Rensselaer County, live in the town of Brunswick, and so I'm familiar with the plateau and actually spend a fair bit of time recreating up there. I don't live far from the plateau, and so it's easy for me to get up in there to hunt or fish or hike or snowshoe. And so I very much, like you all, appreciate the benefits of having the plateau in our backyard. And so let me just get into it here. I'm going to start by just kind of explaining the history and story of black bear and moose in New York and the plateau. I want to talk a little bit about some of the natural history of each of these species and then how we're managing them and provide a little bit of context for the plateau as well. Unfortunately, as we'll see as I move forward, we don't have a lot of direct and specific data related to the plateau itself. And so much of what I'm going to cover is going to be more general in nature, but of course is applicable to the moose and bear on the plateau. And there's a few details in here to try to bring it closer to home as well. And so moose and bear in New York actually share a similar story historically. And both populations suffered quite a lot in the 1800s through overharvest for food consumption and hides, as well as changes in our landscape that severely constricted and constrained the distribution of bear and moose and many of our wildlife species during that time. Something like 80 to 90% of the forest cover in New York was removed in the 1800s and cleared for agricultural purposes. And with that went most of the habitat for bear and moose. And so their hides were a market value, their meat was market value, and their forest cover was lost. And so we saw substantial changes in these wildlife populations. In fact, the last moose was thought to have been removed from New York in 1892. Wow. And we didn't have moose return to New York until about 1980. So it was a 90-year period there where we didn't have moose in the state at all. Black bear, as you'll see, didn't actually get extirpated from the state, but as the habitat was constricted, the black bear populations were most kind of remnant in the hardest to reach areas of the Adirondacks and Catskills. And so that map that you see in the upper left there is illustrating what we predicted or estimated the population to be distributed throughout this state in the 1950s. And so that cross-hatched area represents where bears were most readily to be found. Of course, bears are very wide-ranging animals, and so they may disperse and move and be seen in a variety of areas that are outside kind of where the breeding population was. But we had this remnant population in the Southwest that bordered with the northern woods of Pennsylvania, and then the more isolated areas in the Catskills and Adirondacks. The map in the upper right shows the distribution that we estimated in the mid-90s and the mid-2000s, and you can see that the range had expanded through that 40 to 50 year period. And then again, between 2007 or between 95 and 2007, continued to expand. And sometime in there, around 2000, in that range, is when we started seeing bears more regularly in Eastern New York. Now, of course, those of you who have lived here for a while probably remember stories of seeing bears even in the 90s and maybe years prior. Maybe they've been here quite a bit longer, but we share a bear population with Massachusetts and Vermont. And the state boundary doesn't mean anything to the bears, and they'll move back and forth across. And so the distribution of bears in New York, as we started seeing them more in the 2000s, it was part of a natural expansion of the bear populations from Massachusetts and Vermont, as well as probably some shift from the Catskills as well. But it was more likely a movement from Massachusetts and Vermont into New York, that expansion that started to establish the population here. As I said, bears are wide ranging, and so it's not uncommon, even in the areas that are shown in white in the map there, for bears to be seen periodically. But where we have breeding populations, that's what we're identifying here in this yellow crosshatch and the blue. And then down in the 2011, we mapped it out a little bit differently, but you can see the core range and a secondary range where bears are moving around. Even still, this is about 10 years later now, I would expect that map that you see in the bottom, we might see some continuity between the Catskill area and the Adirondack area, maybe through Otsego and Montgomery counties. There might be some junction, maybe in through Madison and Herkimer County. Bears will move through that space, and so it's probably expanded a little bit more. However, much of the area that's shown in that light color tan in that map from 2011 is areas that's less compatible for bears. We have a lot more agriculture. Of course, the I-90 corridors through there. And so it's less ideal for bears to be, higher risk area for bears to be, because the potential for conflict is greater. So that's the bear distribution that we have in the state now. Moose, again, similar story. So they were extirpated in the 1890s. In the early 1980s, we started seeing a few moose. And so you can see there's some black dots on the upper left map showing where we had sightings from the public of moose. And I don't recall the year, but we have a picture of a bear of a moose that was sighted on the Lake Ontario shorelines in Jefferson County in the early 80s, and was one of the first documented moose in the state. And so the moose were moving around trying to find mates, and so they were seen several times. You can see that the population increased by the 80s, the 90s, and through 95, the distribution was greater. We've continued to collect information from the public in terms of where moose are distributed, but this has been a fairly slow growth in the northern part of the state for the moose population. Of course, now we're blessed to have moose in Rensselaer County periodically, and so we'll talk through some of that moving forward. Here with this progression in the 90s, we actually asked the public, and of course this predated my involvement with the program, but around 1990 there was a question: should the agency get involved in actually restoring moose to New York? And at that time, the public weighed the trade-offs associated with that in terms of the costs and the likelihood of success or failure, and recommended that the state not take any direct intervention to foster moose population growth, but just allow the moose population to repatriate the state naturally. And that's indeed what has happened since. And we've seen slow growth in that population. But as you see, going from a handful of sightings of moose in the early 80s to what looks to be maybe 100 sightings there in 95, We now routinely have moose sightings throughout the northern part of the state. Most recently here in 2019, we mapped them out, and you can see the number of sightings that extend throughout the Adirondacks, even into the St. Lawrence area, central New York, all the way down into Dutchess County a couple times. And so we have some of these outliers, Dutchess County and Greene County, where moose are rare, but they too can go on pretty long range movements. And when they show up in a place where people aren't used to them, they get reported. And so we have some of these unusual sightings. But in the Rensselaer County area, similar to moose or to bear, we have sort of a shared population across our boundary. Moose from Connecticut, northwestern Connecticut, from western Massachusetts, and from southwestern Vermont will move readily back and forth across the border with New York. And so for any moose that we see on the plateau, that's not necessarily a New York moose all the time. It's very likely a moose that goes back and forth to Vermont and Massachusetts and may not stay in New York the whole time. So that's kind of the historical perspective of how we've seen moose populations change through time in New York. And I want to go into more detail now, talk more specifically about black bear, give you some of the natural history of bears, what we do for management of bears, and then I'll move into moose in a while. So one question we often get with black bears is what kind of bear do we have in New York? If we just ask the public that question, you'd be surprised how many people think we have grizzly bears and polar bears in New York. And although there are 8 species of bears worldwide, we only have one in New York, and that's the American black bear. In North America, we also have grizzly bears and polar bears, but of course they don't live here. Grizzly bears would be out west, and polar bears in the north. American black bears versus Americanus. Our bears, generally, the adult males will weigh somewhere between 150 to 450 pounds. Average lifespan is 4 to 6 years. For females, it's 125 to 225 pounds. Actually, I think I have those two ages mixed up. I think it's 3 to 5 for males and 4 to 6 for females. But they can live 20, 30 years in the wild even. But generally, the mortality sources for bears, either the conflict within bears, disease, vehicle strike, or hunting harvest, keeps the age distribution of bears quite a bit lower. We have bears every year that are harvested in New York that dress upwards of 500 and occasionally even 600 pounds. And so a 450-pound bear is a big bear, but a 600-pound bear is enormous. And so that happens periodically. That's a dressed weight, which means after its viscera has been removed. Estimated live weight's probably another 20% more than that, so 700 pounds or more. So really large bears. Of course, that's not as large as they can get. In some other areas with better food sources and easier climates, black bears can push 800 pounds as a live weight. We haven't seen that in New York yet. So the breeding season for bears is in anywhere from late May into August, but primarily in June and July. Bears have a unique physiological function in which females are impregnated, but actually don't ovulate right away. And so that implantation of the egg doesn't happen until the bear is nearing den season. So even though the breeding season is happening in June and July, that fertilized egg doesn't implant in the uterine wall until probably November. And what that does is allow the gestation period of the cubs to then be timed appropriately so that they can be born in the den. And so female bears will bear 1 to 6 cubs, but 2 to 3 is pretty common. It's a rarity that we see up to 5 cubs. I've not seen 6 in New York, but it is possible. And so every year we hear 1 or 2 situations where somebody sees 5 cubs. It's pretty remarkable to think of the energy expenditure of a sow having to raise 5 cubs as they're growing inside the den. But when that female is in good condition and has ample fat and food supply for the fall, she may be able to do it. Bears are wild. And one of the reasons I regret not being able to be with you in person is I'd like to hear your stories. I'd like to understand what your experience has been with bears and what you've seen. And so I'll show you a bunch of pictures and hopefully you can appreciate that. Hopefully you have your own pictures. But bears are remarkable creatures, generally very wary of people, very timid in their behavior. People have a lot of misconceptions about black bears. Bears are excellent climbers, excellent swimmers. Black bears are not always black. We have bears every year that we get pictures of that are cinnamon colored or brown colored, even blonde. Now, of course, that's much more rare. Black is the most common in New York, but there are some color variations. Bears are very seldom aggressive towards people. And so even though they are capable of causing quite a lot of damage and being dangerous, generally they are not. And almost all of the circumstances that involve a human interaction with a bear, a injury of some form, is the result of a defensive behavior of bears, or a situation where that bear has been habituated to people's presence because of food, and they become more and more aggressive in trying to get the food, and the person got in the way. Occasionally we have a situation where there's a dog that's been involved, where a bear encountered a dog and the bear reacted to the dog, and sometimes the dog chases the person, or the bear chases the dog back to the person, and so there's an injury. But again, that's very, very rare. Most all of the circumstances where bears are in close proximity to people, people never know they're there. The bear will leave, the bear will hide, the bear will climb a tree, and the person never realizes it. And so they're usually very timid and very wary, naturally shy. Bears den every winter in New York. This is a survival strategy, going underground or into a period of reduced metabolic status when food resources are scarce. And so bears go through a period in the fall called hyperphagia, where they consume thousands of calories, maybe 20,000 calories in a day, in order to bulk up their body mass and store fat that will then sustain them through 4, maybe 6 months without any food consumption. This period of denning behavior of bears is really remarkable. It's different than true hibernation. Bears don't drop their heart rate or respiratory rate, their body temperature, to the same degree that true hibernators do. They can actually be quite alert when they're in the den, in sort of a restful state, sleeping. They do reduce their metabolism slightly, but not anywhere near like a true hibernator. But they may go this whole period without eating, without urinating, without defecating, without having any muscle atrophy, even though they're relative motionless for that entire period. And they can come out of the den at the end of the winter season and be ready to go without really any loss from that time. Of course, they would have lost some body weight because they've been metabolizing their fat reserves, but they don't lose any bone density. So really remarkable physiological advantage for the bears, something that medical researchers have been studying for quite some time to try to understand what is happening physiologically so that it can be used for human medicine. Bears will pick all sorts of structures for dens. Doesn't have to be underground. There's 2 pictures here in the center of one where kind of a root mass has been dug out for a bear to crawl underneath there. One, a rock cavity. Sometimes bears will just den underneath a downed brush pile or a log. You can see the picture of me there pulling a cub out of a tree cavity. It's probably unfair of me to put that picture in there because it's such a rarity for me to get to be involved in that sort of thing. Our field staff do that type of work, and every once in a while I get to invite myself along. And if anyone's astute, they'll realize that there's no gray hairs in that picture, so it's been a while as well. But one of the remarkable things about bear dens is that you notice the picture there on the lower right. Sometimes the bears just den in relatively open ground. There's no structure above this bear to protect it in any way from the elements. It has some horizontal structure that would protect it or give it some visible screening. So anybody moving in the area or another bear or other wildlife aren't going to be, the bear's not going to be interacting with them. It's going to be hidden that way, but it's not protected from snow or rain. And it'll bear its young in that space, nurse its young, and they'll be just fine, completely exposed like that. We'll find a bear completely covered in snow and crusted over because it's denned in open ground like that. So as I said, 1 to 6 cubs born midwinter, January to February is when they're born. They're only born at about a ½ pound. You see how small it is in the center there. And so that cub will be born. It'll crawl up to the nipple of the sow and just sit there and nurse and grow as she protects it and provides us warmth. At the point of emergence, maybe 5 to 9 pounds. I should have mentioned with these den situations, the timing of den is really variable. It depends on a lot of things. It depends on the food that's available in the woods at that time. It depends on the snow cover, which of course affects the availability of natural foods. It depends on the sex and the age of the bear. It depends on the pregnancy status. And so what often happens is in a poor food year, where there's not many acorns or beechnuts and bears haven't been able to store as much fat, or there's not much reason for bears to continue to stay out, they'll go into den a little bit early. Likewise, if there's deep snow comes quickly, they'll go into den and they'll just stay in. They may, if there's a thaw, they may get up and feed a little bit more, but they'll den when the snow comes deep. Females that are with cubs will den first. Females that don't have cubs will kind of be the second group of bears to find a den. And then the adult male bears will be the third group that will den. So they'll be out longer. And so when we as managers set our hunting seasons, we could, if we needed to tailor this timing of our seasons such that we are targeting certain demographics of bears more than others. Extending the seasons later allows us to have more harvested males later in the season, as most of the females are starting to go into den. Same sort of pattern happens on the spring side of things. The females with cubs will stay in the dens the longest, whereas the males will be first ones to leave the den. And they'll be out and about even before the snow melts sometimes. Now, bears eat all sorts of things. They are opportunistic omnivores. And if you see the picture of the jaw there in the upper left, the jaw structure helps inform us about what bears are going to eat. And you can see these sharp, long canines at the front of the jaw. And yet the back of the jaw has these large grinding molars. And so bears are very capable of predating on other animals or scavenging previously dead animals. And so bears will kill fawns and consume fawns in the springtime. They will scavenge on deer that die for other reasons. Pretty rare for a bear to kill an adult deer, but they would certainly take a deer that was killed by a vehicle and consume it, or a deer that died from other causes. But those grinding teeth on the back are the more important teeth for the bear because probably 80 to 90% of the bear's diet is vegetation. And so it needs those grinding molar teeth in order to break apart nuts and to grind up vegetable matter that make up the bulk of the diet. And so, of course, the diet of bears changes throughout the seasons. When we first have spring, and you'll have skunk cabbage come available in the marshes and some sedges be available. Bears are going to be feeding on that. And then as the spring wildflowers start to pop in May, bears are quick to feed on the succulent vegetation and the flower tops. As trees start to flower, bears are going to consume the flower parts of aspen, ash, and maples. Of course, berries and nuts later in the year. Tubers, grasses, maple samaras. Bears are very adept at making use of all the natural foods out there because they need to consume quite a lot. As summer progresses, they also use insects as a primary food source. And so you may see evidence of bears in your woods by the ripped apart logs as they're looking for grubs, or overturned rocks as they're looking for ant larvae. And so bears can actually consume quite a lot of ant larvae. They've got long tongues. They can just lick them right off the rocks and make that a large portion of the diet. But of course, bears are great climbers. And so when the apples are ripe in the fall, they'll make ready use of that. And you can see the picture there on the right. That's a beech tree where bears have climbed the tree and pulled branches in to pull beech nuts off of the branch. And they make this sort of bear nest. And so this is an indicator that there are bears in the area. I look for this all the time when I'm walking on the Taconic Ridge. And if you're hiking in Pittstown or Grafton, you may see some evidences of this in those areas. Of course, other sign you're probably all familiar with, bear scat, bear tracks, and bear scars on smooth bark trees. Again, as I'm hiking in the plateau, I'm always looking for evidences of bear on our beech trees. And unfortunately, I haven't seen as much as I was expecting to, but bear tracks shown there on the right. Bear have, what you're seeing here, the first track at the bottom is the right front foot, followed by the left, or rather the right hind foot, and then the left front foot. And so the bear's toes, they have 5 toes. The innermost toe, it's different than humans. So our big toe, just like our big thumb, on the inside of our hand, bears, their largest toe is on the outside. And so when you see the track, the innermost toe may not actually always be visible. It is here in this snow, but sometimes in soft mud, or in sand, you may not see that innermost toe. You may only see 4 prints, but they do have these 5 toes, with the largest one being on the outside. They have sort of an alternating gait pattern. And one of the interesting things about bears is as they walk a path through the woods, they often will use the same exact foot placement as they walk through a consistent area. So if there's a trail that bears are using consistently, they will step over a log consistently in the same pattern, place their pad in the same place time after time. And you can actually distinctly see areas where bears have traveled. It's not a defined beaten path like you'd see for deer trail, where all the dirt has been removed and is disturbed from multiple uses. It can almost look like footpads placed one after the other as they move through soft ground, stepping over a stick in the same way, stepping on the same rock time after time. And so they do that consistently as they walk. So in terms of population management, for black bears, hunting harvest is our primary tool for adjusting populations. And we can change how we regulate the hunting harvest in order to achieve different management objectives. As the bear population has changed in New York, expanded both in number and distribution, we've modified how we have set our hunting seasons in order to accomplish our objectives. Now, the objectives that you see the map there on the left, that's a process those are generated in conjunction with the public. And so we work with public stakeholder groups and through surveys to assess what the public's interests are and what their experiences are with bears, and whether or not we should seek to increase or decrease populations in certain areas. Have the impacts of bears in those areas been too negative, or are the benefits of bears outweighing the costs of having bears? And so those sorts of things play into the factors. And you can see from that map that there's really only one area of the state where we're seeking to reduce bear populations, and that is in the Catskill region. That's also the area where we've seen the greatest population growth. The harvest that you see on the graph there shows harvest change over the last 50 years. By the mid-90s, we started to see that population grow in the Catskill region in particular, and we started to see bear populations be more distributed evenly across the southern zone. We started to have bears more in central New York and kind of moving northward into the Finger Lakes. So the distribution of bears changed. Now, to some degree, this harvest graph isn't a perfect reflection of population abundance. We know that. It's a metric to follow what was maybe happening with the population over time, more of a trend assessment. But it also illustrates changes that we've made with the hunting harvest. We've expanded the areas that bears can be hunted and expanded the time frame which bears can be hunted. And so that influences the total harvest number. So we have to keep that in mind as we're interpreting these data. But the other interesting thing that you notice in this harvest graph is that there's a lot of variability. And it's one of the challenges that we have with managing bear populations is that we do have quite a bit of variability, both in the harvest and in the population. Now, the population line is not going to look quite as jagged as this, but bears are very susceptible to, or I should say it differently, both bear harvest from hunters and bear reproduction is influenced by the availability of natural foods. And so what happens is we have these really primary food sources for bears in the fall and in preparation for winter den season, acorns and beech nuts, that those tree species produce mass on a multi-year cycle. And so it's not even food sources every year. And the bear population responds to that. Physiologically, females are better prepared to produce young when they have ample food support. And so over time, larger portions of the females are bearing young on similar years that correspond to good food sources or good food years. And so the population has this reproductive synchrony where a larger portion of the female population is bearing young in one year than the next. And we see that then in the harvest. It plays out because there are more bears available in years following those good food sources. So there's kind of these little spikes in the population because of pulses of births. But having available abundant foods or lack of foods also influences harvest. because bears don't need to move as much when there is a ton of food available. When there are acorns everywhere around, a bear doesn't need to wander very far to find food. That means it's going to be less vulnerable to hunters. And so you see that real sharp spike there in 2003 in the northern zone. That was a year of food scarcity, and bears moved wide distances in order to try to find food before they went into den. That made them very vulnerable to hunting, and hunters took advantage and took a lot of bears. So that was an anomaly that was experienced not just in New York, but all throughout the Northeast. Highest harvest year of most states in the Northeast was 2003 because of that mass failure. And you see the bear population didn't really suffer much from it. It was a sharp peak, but overall our harvest levels of black bears are fairly low. And so even though it looked like a really remarkable harvest, and it was, it didn't have any long-term repercussions on the bear population in the northern zone. Harvest also gives us the opportunity to collect a lot of data. And so for black bears, we collect age at harvest information, we can collect weight information, and these are other trends that give us data about the bear population itself that we can monitor to make sure that we're knowing what's happening with the population and that our management is set accordingly. Specifically in Rensselaer County, we can have the towns here and the number of bears that were taken over the last 3 years, not including 2021. And you can see that is, I think, the town of Berlin that has the highest number of bears taken recently. But the Plateau and the Taconics really account for the majority of bears that are taken in Rensselaer County. Now I'm going to try to pick up the pace here because I think I'm going to run too long if I keep going as slow as I am. But one of the other aspects of our management program is engaging in research. And so we do periodic projects to help us understand bear productivity, bear survival, bear movements, bear habitats. And so you're seeing here one of our staff members weighing a cub, putting an ear tag on a bear and a radio collar on a bear that we're going to use to monitor that bear moving forward. We also periodically engage in some population estimate work. So this was a project that we did with Cornell University and a doctoral student there, where we used hair snares. These are barbed wire corrals that we baited so the bears would be enticed to come inside the barbed wire, leave a little sample of hair on that barbed wire. We could then collect that and do DNA analysis of it. We would then clean off all the barbs so there would be no hair, rebait it, and then collect hair again at some point later. And we would be able to see how many of the second sampling period had hairs from the same bears that were found during the first sampling period versus bears that didn't show up in either other of the other sampling periods. And that is a technique that we can use to estimate the bear population in the region. I think I have a video here I can show you of what this looks like. So the bear got his food reward. And now you can see where he's about to leave a hair sample for us. See that wire bouncing in the background? Well, we just collected some sample. So this is a non-invasive way that we can collect information about the bear population without us actually having to physically handle the bear. The bear is better for it, and it's a lot less cumbersome for us than actually handling the bear. It is still an expensive project, but we were able to use this across the southern zone to estimate that we have about 4,000 bears in the southern part of the state. Now, those look like the fun things that we might do, but the reality is the majority of what we get engaged with black bears is human-bear conflicts because people haven't figured out how to live with bears yet. And these two situations, bears getting into bird feeders and into garbage, are the primary culprits. These are the primary attractants that we don't do a good job with keeping our spaces clean that create bad habits for bears. The real challenge and problem with this behavior of bears is that as bears get accustomed to finding food near people's homes, they become more habituated to it, and they're conditioned towards that food, and they may become more aggressive in their attempts to get food in the future. And that could lead to situations like you see here on the right, where there's a vehicle that's been broken into or a house that's been broken into. And unfortunately, those situations almost always result in the death of the bear. And it was predicated because someone didn't take the care to take down their bird feeder when bears were active, or to keep their garbage stored properly before pickup. And so I suspect there's probably several of you that have had this happen, because I know it does happen in Rensselaer County. And so we'll mention here in a few minutes about the ways to reduce these conflicts. But of course, conflicts don't just come from sort of artificial food sources. We have agriculture scenarios, apiaries, where these can be primary conflicts for bears as well. Apiaries are pretty easy to resolve with some electric fencing that's very successful. It's much harder to resolve situations of corn damage from bears. It really needs to have constant hazing. Sometimes we use dogs, trained dogs and houndsmen to run bears out of cornfield, but often it's more a situation of doing local population management and population reduction of the bears to reduce those conflicts. Specifically here in our area, I mapped out the conflicts by town for Rensselaer County over the last couple of years, and you can see Stephentown has the high there, but also Petersburg and Hoosick, Nassau and Skodak. But as I mentioned, garbage and bird feeder are the primary reasons for conflicts. And so these are things that are preventable, things that we can remove the attractants to remove the problem. And so our primary message is never feed bears. Direct intentional feeding of bears is actually illegal because it does create problems. We always encourage people, when bears are active, to store food, garbage, and recycling in places and in ways that bears can't get it. And so if the garbage is going to be collected on a Thursday morning, don't put the garbage out Wednesday night because a bear will get to it. Put it out Thursday morning before the collection comes. If you're storing garbage, store it indoors or in a secure outbuilding so that bears can't get access to it. Remove bird feeders when bears are active, and don't feed your pets outdoors. If bears are active in your area, clean your grill and let your neighbors know. Really, bear problems are not a personal problem. It's a community issue. And so when one person does their job of keeping their food secure and their garbage secure and taking down their bird feeders, but the neighbor doesn't, that doesn't mean the bear is going to respect your property boundaries. It might be the neighbor that's making the mess, but the bear might smell your apple pie. And so that's the issue. We want to make sure the community as a whole is addressing these conflicts and removing the attractants. So I have this little intermission slide here. Sophie, if there are any questions about black bears, we can take that now, or we can just push it off and wait till the very end.
Well, we have two questions if you're up for answering them. One is what your thoughts are and whether or not you're surprised on New York State being able to sustain a legal bear kill of about 1,500 annually.
So I'm not surprised. I mean, we estimate we have 6,000 to 8,000 bears in the state. And so having 1,500 bears as in a harvest is a very reasonable harvest rate. And actually it's generally not quite that high. I suspect the harvest this year is going to be around 1,000 or so, a little bit lower than the past few years. But we're right in the ballpark of where we expect to be.
All right, and then our second question is, how much weight does a bear gain and lose throughout a year?
That is a good question, and it's going to depend on the age and size of the bear, because as you can imagine, a bear that's starting out as 150 pounds is going to add some mass in the year, but it's not going to be anywhere near as much mass as a 450-pound bear is going to put on in advance of the winter. And so proportionally, we might be looking at 25% of the bear's mass may increase in advance of the den season. And I don't know what the proportion is exactly. So it may be more than that. It may be slightly less, but it's going to vary depending on the bear.
Okay, we've had a few more questions come up if you'd like to continue.
Yeah, how about one more and then we'll move on, because again, I want to be sensitive to folks' time.
Okay, so do bears return to the same den every year?
Good question. The answer is probably not. There may be occasions where bears do return to the same den, or other bears may use a den used by another bear previously. But the reality is, in New York, we are not limited for den site opportunities for bears. We have so many rock crevices, large trees with tree cavities, brush piles in the woods, down to logs that provide ample opportunities for bears to den, that there's not a limitation for spaces. Some places in the country, that's not always the case. It may be in some areas like flooded areas of Louisiana where bears live and do go into dens, and they're looking only for tree cavities. Den sites might be more limited, than they might be reused more often. That's certainly not the case for us. So let me jump into moose, which is probably what everybody's really excited about because they are cool animals and ones we just don't get to see nearly enough, but getting to see more often. And so I have not yet seen a moose in Rensselaer County. I have seen tracks. That's not even true. Forgive me. I did see a moose. There was one about 7 or 8 years ago that came down off the plateau along the Post and Kill and was hanging out for an afternoon along Spring Ave Extension and ended up dying a couple of days later down along the Post and Kill in Troy. And unfortunately, this is actually a common story or a likely story for many of the moose in our area. Because our moose exist at the southernmost extent of their range across the globe, that puts them in a stressful situation physiologically. They encounter more parasites than moose do that are further north. And the environmental variables are more stressful for them. And so the moose that I saw in Rensselaer County died of something called brainworm. It's a parasite that's carried by white-tailed deer that does not harm the deer, but moose are very susceptible to it. And so it was basically kind of losing its mind, not being able to think properly, and just followed the stream down towards Troy till it ultimately succumbed from the disease. But I did see tracks one time over on some of the conservation easement land along the Taconic Crest. And so I'm waiting to see another live and healthy moose in Rensselaer County. That hasn't happened for me yet. So anyhow, as the slide shows here, moose are circumpolar, largely boreal forest and northern forests. You can see in North America, the range extends into the lower 48 in the western states, in the upper Midwest, and then in New England. And so here in the Northeast, we have moose that extend through the Adirondacks, down along the Taconic Crest, Rensselaer Plateau, into somewhat of Columbia County. And then, of course, there's a population of moose in northwestern Connecticut, western Massachusetts, and Vermont. And so that's the distribution. But the fact is that as we sit there on that southern edge, it makes the future of moose in New York more uncertain. Whatever impacts we have from climate change in the next 20 years, the next 50 years, are going to play out in influencing the future of moose in New York. We're not exactly sure what that future is going to look like because we don't know exactly how moose are going to respond to the changes in our climate. As we may end up with some warmer winters, that may make them more vulnerable in some circumstances, but they still are somewhat adaptive. And so we don't have all the answers yet for what the future holds. You can see here a map of the sightings from the last 4 years in Rensselaer County. Looks like the town of Berlin wins for the most sightings over this period, but it's not a lot. And so this would include tracks or actual animals seen. As I recall, looking at the specific data, most of these were adult males, but there were cows with calves that were also seen. And so that's good. It indicates that we have not just males moving transients through, but we also have a breeding population that are in the area. Again, moose are all-seas. The bulls can weigh up to 1,500 pounds. That would be a large bull for New York. Cows are up to 1,000 pounds. I think most of the adult cows that we've handled have been in the 800 to 900 pound. Breeding season for moose is just a little bit earlier than it is for deer. Starts in September, late September, and runs into mid-October. Calves are born in May and June. 1 or 2 calves is common in a healthy population. Now, this time of year, moose are shedding their antlers, and so adult bull moose may be more difficult to distinguish from a female moose. And so I wanted to at least give you some guidance here. If you see a moose this time of year, how to distinguish a bull from a cow. And so generally, cows have a lighter colored face, a brownish face, where a bull moose's face is going to appear black. But a really prominent and easy visual indicator is this white vulva patch. And so if you notice on the tail end of the moose, sort of right underneath her tail, she's got this white patch of hair. The males do not have that. And so if you see a moose walking away from you, look for the facial color, as well as that vulva patch or lack thereof to distinguish whether it's a bull or a cow. Of course, if it's got antlers, you know it's going to be a bull, but that's not always the case once they shed their antlers. So I guess I should just say that that is one of the characteristics of moose. They're the largest deer species in North America and in New York. They grow those antlers every year, grow them and then shed them, grow them and then shed them. And they generally get larger as the animal gets older. That's a lot of energy that animal puts into those antlers, and then loses it so it doesn't have to carry all that extra weight through the harsher climate of winter. Moose sign you're more likely to see than the actual animal. I show illustration there on the left for the difference in size between the moose and the deer print, since they are shaped very similarly. Depending on the substrate, if you're looking at snow that may have melted out, this can be a difficult one because deer hoof prints will, as the snow melts, will cup out and look larger. But the actual size of moose hoof print is there, like you see, about the size of your hand. And so hopefully you've had a chance to see those. If not, keep your eyes open. Moose obviously also poop in the woods, and the moose poop is shaped similar to deer, but it's quite a bit larger. And so inch in size or so, these pellets in groupings, and you can see the size of the grouping is quite a bit larger than it would be for a deer. Like deer, moose will scrape their antlers against trees and make rubs. And so you'll see this periodically. They'll scrape the velvet, the growing tissue off their antlers in the late summer, as well as use these as marking trees to alert other moose of their presence. Different than deer, though, this is going to be at about chest height rather than at knee height, which you'd see for the rubbing of deer. And then the picture on the right shows barking by moose. Now, I don't have a picture of the moose skull, but if we were to look at the jaw of a moose, they have no top front teeth. Their upper palate just has a hard palate on the front, and they have incisors on the bottom, but not the top. And so what they'll do, and deer do this as well, but again, this is going to be larger tooth marks and higher up on a tree. As a food source during winter, they will get their lower teeth underneath the edge of the bark and rip it up. And then they'll chew that bark and consume the cambium layer underneath the bark as part of their nourishment. And typically you'll see this in areas where they're a little bit more food stressed, where there's not as much browse available. Same thing for deer. You may start to see some of this on smaller saplings where that deer may do this in areas where they're food stressed. But barking like this, large tooth marks, vertical strips on trees, very common on striped maple, is an evidence that there's moose in the area. So moose generally feed on birch, aspen, striped maple, red maple, balsam fir all year round. Wintertime, we're mostly talking about balsam fir. In the summertime, moose spend a lot of time in water, feeding on aquatic vegetation, as well as browsing on other hardwoods. But they need to consume somewhere between 40 and 60 pounds per day. So that's a lot of vegetation, which creates some conflict. Areas where moose like to feed are areas of young growing forests. They produce the most food and forage per acre of any forest. Now, there's the problem in that areas that produce the best moose food are areas that are being actively managed for timber production as well. And so when a moose consumes 40 to 60 pounds of seedlings and sapling buds, that does quite a lot of damage to regenerating forests. And so in our area, not so much a concern because we don't have many moose. In areas, portions of the Adirondacks where the moose are most concentrated, it can be an issue on specific properties. Not a general widespread issue at the moment, but it's potentially an issue in the future. But really the question for us with moose is really what's the future hold? There is a lot of uncertainty for moose in New York. In fact, not just New York, but across New England and the upper Midwest, biologists across these regions are seeing difficulty with moose populations. You can see the headlines here from Minnesota or Vermont or Maine, Wyoming and Montana, where state after state is seeing moose population declines. But here we are in a situation where we've watched our moose population grow from this fledgling start in 1980 to roughly 700 or so that we have now. And we're not seeing quite the same issues, but we're also not seeing the population growth that we might have expected. Maybe our expectations were wrong, and maybe there's nothing going on that's negative with the moose population, but we don't really know. And yet there's all these concerns that other states are seeing that raise red flags for us. Because moose have been a relative rarity for New York, we really don't know near as much about them as we do many of other managed species. And so for the last few years, we have spent a considerable amount of time, energy, and money to try to help learn more about moose. And this work is still ongoing. So we have a bunch of questions, and our work has really been geared towards this. We've been looking to figure out what's the best way to actually monitor the moose population. Now, I threw out that number 700, and I'll get to how we got that. But there's a lot of question when a moose population or any animal population like we have with moose is relatively low density, scarcely populated on the landscape. It's really hard to figure out how many you have. You can spend a lot of time trying to find them on the landscape to try to count them. And the methodology to do that is pretty tricky. And so we've explored several different approaches, and I'll walk through that in a minute. We also have questions about their productivity and survival. How many calves are we getting per cow, and what's the survivorship of the adults and the young? We know we have these parasite issues. I mentioned brainworm. What about our habitat? How's our habitat compared to Maine? Do we have good habitat in New York to support a moose population or a growing moose population? How many can we hold? And so these questions are things that we've started to explore. A couple of years ago, we worked with graduate students at Cornell on a project to try to figure out, could we use another non-invasive technique to sample moose? I mentioned the genetic mark recapture that we did with bears, where we were collecting the hair snares. You could do the same thing with scat. Each of these little pellets contains a little bit of DNA from that moose. And if we can extract that DNA, we can learn information about that moose and the moose population that we can actually then use to help estimate the moose population. So we worked with these dogs that are specifically trained to actually detect moose scat. We ran transects with these dogs throughout the Adirondack region to detect scat, clean the transect, and then go back a couple weeks later to try to find moose scat again, see how many were the same moose versus different moose. Unfortunately, this project didn't really work out. We had such trouble with the genetic extraction from the moose scat. It had worked previously in New York in a pilot program. It had worked in other states. It didn't work for us this time. So it was a pretty labor-intensive project, pretty cool design, but didn't amount to what we had hoped it to. So we regrouped and went to the air. And you'll notice here for this work, we've concentrated on the Adirondacks. Even though we're blessed to have some moose in Rensselaer County, the bulk of the moose population is in the Adirondack Park. And so that's where our research is focused for the moment. And so we used a technique called aerial distance sampling, where we flew transects, which is a line through the Adirondacks, and we broke the whole park up into grids and sampled certain grids. And you can see there in the center, there's sort of a box that shows red lines. Those are the sample transects, about 6 miles long. What we would do is observe and study or stare at the ground looking for moose as we flew these transects. And if we'd see them, we'd fly off of our transect over the moose, take a GPS coordinate and take pictures and get information about the moose, and then go back onto our transect and keep going until we found another moose. This methodology allows us to estimate the encounter rate that we have for moose, the detection probability, and then to estimate the overall number of moose that we can find using this methodology. We had to fine tune it over a series of years. And so as you see, this is where we generated our estimate of about 716 moose in the Adirondack Park. Now we know there's moose in the St. Lawrence area, some of the Tug Hill, of course, down along Washington, Rensselaer, and Columbia counties. So the actual number of moose in New York is probably 800, maybe a little bit more, but roughly 700 in the Adirondacks. And so we're going to use this technique moving forward on sort of a 3-year cycle, 3 years on, 3 years off. We finished the last round of surveys in, I guess it would have been 2019. We're taking a 1-year break here in that cycle, but we're going to start that back up in 2023. And so we're going to be then using this approach moving forward to monitor moose population, both distribution and abundance. And this will give us a better picture as to what's happening with the population trajectory of moose. But what it also helped us figure out is where moose are distributed across the state, or the Adirondacks in particular. And you can see here that moose aren't uniformly distributed. There's sort of these hotspot pockets. These are areas where there are managed forest lands, conservation easement properties that are being actively managed for forest production. So the trees are being harvested, there's regeneration occurring, and it provides great food source for moose. Now, the areas that are largely red on this map that are outside those hotspots, that's our forest preserve. Forest preserve doesn't hold much potential for moose. There's a lot of summer vegetation in the aquatic habitats in the Adirondacks. But in terms of winter food sources and browse regenerating stands, not in our forest preserve. And so it's really the benefit of these conservation easements and the active forests, actively managed forests in the Adirondacks that are going to play a critical role in moose populations and the sustainability of moose populations in northern New York and in the plateau. And of course, we're fortunate to have several conservation easements and some active forestry in the plateau. And so that will probably, as long as we continue to tolerate climate change and have some active forest management, we'll still have moose, at least for the near term. We're also looking at how are moose using the landscape? What are we going to get for survivorship of moose? And can we figure out how many cows or how many calves the cows are having? We can do this by actually collaring and tagging moose. And so in a couple years ago, we did a project, and we're doing a new one now, where we used helicopter net gunning to capture moose and put GPS radio collars on them. So I have a little illustration here of that. Hopefully this shows up for you.
Pierce with a knife, crossword clue.
So the helicopter follows the moose till it gets out into an area that is open enough to safely land the helicopter and to safely have the moose down. Crew jumps out, tackles the moose to the ground, and then they're able to put a GPS collar on it, collect some blood samples and so on. This video was actually not from New York. It was made in New Hampshire by the same crew that came to New York and did the capture work for us. You could see as that moose was standing there, it had a big patch of hair missing on its shoulder. That's caused by the consequence of these moose in New Hampshire having winter tick, which is one of the parasites that we're concerned about in New York and we're monitoring for. We're fortunate that we haven't seen problems with winter tick as has been the case in some other New England states. But one of the other assessments that we're doing is this health monitoring approach, looking at all these different parasite risks that can play a factor in moose survivorship. Winter tick is a big one. It's the primary reason that moose populations in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont have been declining. But as I said, our population densities are low enough that the moose or the winter tick doesn't seem to have been a problem. So we haven't seen any situations where moose have been missing large portions of hair, like was shown in that video. The tick can really become abundant on moose, and it causes them to be irritated, and they'll rub their bodies against trees, which actually rubs the hair off. This happens throughout the winter, and so moose are then exposed to colder temperatures without that extra insulation, and it can be a significant mortality factor, particularly for younger animals. But we're monitoring that. We're also monitoring for brainworm. This is the parasite that has the portion of its life cycle interacting with deer. And so one of the consequences of being on the southern edge of the moose distribution map is that there is greater overlap with other ungulates, primarily deer. And so where there's more deer, there's more parasites, more risk for moose. And brainworm is one that causes mortality for a lot of moose. Liver fluke is another one. It's a parasite of the liver, and it has a life cycle that involves snails. It can be snails and slugs. And so the fluke will lay eggs that then the snail eats. Snail climbs up on a piece of vegetation. The moose inadvertently eats the snail and ingests the parasite. These liver flukes can substantially affect the function of a liver and compromise the moose that way. And so it's actually been a substantial mortality factor for some moose in the upper Midwest. We haven't seen it be a huge issue, although of the collared animals that we had sampled or marked there several years ago, 3 of them died with substantial liver fluke. And so we're monitoring for the presence of liver fluke in our population. Neospora is another parasite that's carried by canids like coyotes. And so that can affect the reproductive status, as well as selenium as a mineral may be deficient in some areas. We're exploring that as a possibility. Selenium has impacts when moose are deficient in selenium. Same for livestock as well. It can have impacts in their ability to reproduce successfully. And so these are questions as well as things that we're just keeping an eye out, wanting to monitor to make sure that we know what is going on with the moose in order to best predict the future for them. But again, what about the carrying capacity? How are forests fare for producing quality moose habitat? And the reality is areas that have good timber harvests produce good food for moose, but areas that are preserved and protected and just aging are not going to produce good food sources for moose. And so we found through our research, what we actually did was with some of our GPS collars, we backtracked moose and counted all the stems that they were consuming as they walked through the woods. What tree species were they feeding on? What size stem? What was the biomass that they were consuming? And then what's the available biomass in the landscape in order to support a moose? And we found, looking at the nutritional quality of those plants that they were eating, that in terms of the woody vegetation, the protein that they were getting in summer was the limiting factor. Now, of course, we weren't looking at the aquatic vegetation, which is an important contribution of their food in summertime. So there is some limitation there. But then through some modeling and looking at the remote sensing data and forest cover across northern New York, we determined that based on woody cover, woody tree species, we can probably sustain about 760 moose in the Adirondacks. And our population estimate right now is about 716. And so, of course, 760 is a low number. It's the minimum because that doesn't include all the beneficial vegetation, aquatic vegetation that moose are going to consume in the summer. So the number that the Adirondacks can support is actually quite a bit higher than 760. But suffice to say that we are nearing the carrying capacity of our terrestrial landscape for moose. But we still have questions. Primary on that is, what's the survival and health of juvenile moose? The adult survivorship seems to be pretty good despite the parasite risks. But what about juveniles? They're potentially more susceptible here. And so even this month, just a couple of weeks ago, we had the capture crew back out and collared 14 juvenile moose to start tracking them and to see what their health status is moving forward. We're also pairing that work with a whole network of trail cameras distributed around the Adirondacks, looking for evidences of winter tick on moose in the springtime, as well as both distribution of moose and the demographic sort of overlap in space use of deer and moose, as that would be potentially influential in parasite risks, as well as looking at actual presence of these parasites in deer scat and in the gastropods, the slugs, and the snails. So we can map out across the Adirondacks where parasite risks may be the highest and relate that to where we know moose densities are, just giving us a better picture of where moose may be in the future. And of course, public input through this process is also important. And so we've been reaching out both to New York residents as well as focal groups of landowners in the Adirondacks to better understand what the public wants for moose. As I said, the future is uncertain for moose, but we need to know what the public's interests are. And so we've been doing this work to understand what the public wants. As you can see here, most people like the fact that we have moose in New York, but there are concerns related to whether the population can persist, whether vehicle collisions are a risk. Of course, a vehicle collision with a moose, much more risky than a collision with a deer. Lesser concern about risk of forest damage, which makes sense. Fewer people are impacted. But by and large, of those who have an opinion, most people want moose populations to increase. We have all those surveys on our website. You can go search that if you're interested in getting great more detail. But as I've alluded to here, moose present a different management situation, a management challenge for us because there's so much uncertainty. What's the impact of climate change going to be for the future of moose in the next 20 years? What's the impact of this parasite risk to moose? Do we have any problems with moose production or moose survivorship in New York? And then we have this relationship with the fact that the public really likes the fact that we have moose and would like to see more, but moose are primarily inhabiting spaces that are private land that's actively managed. And so the public doesn't necessarily have access to the best habitats where moose are using. And as the public wants more moose, the impacts of those moose, the consumption of 40 to 60 pounds of browse, that's a livelihood from somebody that's wanting to regrow those trees. And so there's sort of a public benefit, private cost issue that comes into the management. And so we have to weigh these factors in terms of figuring out what's the best way to maximize the benefit of moose while still caring for the interests of the public at large. So there's the management challenge for moose. I want to just acknowledge that in particular for moose, we have worked quite a lot with many partners, the Wildlife Conservation Society, the Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit at Cornell University, the Cornell University Animal Diagnostic Health Lab, and SUNY ESF Roosevelt Wildlife Station. All have been important partners in our moose work. And so I want to just give them a shout out. So anyhow, I know we went beyond our 8 o'clock timeline, and I'm free to hang out, answer a bunch of questions, whatever you may have. But I appreciate your patience and sticking with me.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Are you ready to continue with questions?
Sure thing.
All right, so one we have going back to the bears is if you could discuss the benefits that the bear population brings to an area.
Well, there's a kind of couple of different ways to angle on that question. Because bears, as part of our ecological system, have benefits to that system itself. Right, that in terms of just being part of the natural ecosystem, contributing to the predation of prey species, to the distribution of seeds for plants, contribute to the ecology of the system. Socially, they have a huge benefit because people like knowing that bears exist in our spaces, even if they don't like them in their backyards. There's sort of an intrinsic value that the public at large places on bears as sort of a symbol of wildness and a symbol of nature. And there's a lot of value that people place on having bears in that space. So maybe two different ways to think about that.
So next question, is there a season when the chance of seeing moose on the plateau is greater?
Season of the year, I assume, is the question. And the answer for that, honestly, I don't know. Because moose will shift their distribution depending on the food sources. And generally in the summertime, they're going to be in areas where they have a little bit more conifer cover and more wetland spaces. Now we have some of that on the plateau. There's some really beautiful wetland spaces on the plateau where when I drive by, I look expecting to see moose. It hasn't happened yet, but I always look, right? And so they would use those spaces. They're cooler environments for the moose. In the summer or in the wintertime, moose aren't actually thermally stressed by the cold. They're built for the cold. And so they'll seek open hardwood spaces where they can actually move around in deep snow just fine and not get too warm. Warmth is actually a challenge for moose in the wintertime. And so those would be areas where we would see moose on regenerating timber harvests, where there's going to be browse available. Again, we have some conservation easements on the plateau and some active timber harvests. And so those would be the places I'd target in winter. Whether there's a greater chance of seeing them in the summer versus winter, I really can't say. And I wish I could point you to a particular spot because I would like to know where it is myself. Most of the times we see moose, it's from the air. Sophie, you're muted at the moment. You might as well just keep your mute off.
How many moose would you estimate are on the plateau alone?
Yeah, here's where I wish we had better information for you. All of our monitoring work, other than collecting public sighting data related to moose, has been done in the Adirondacks, just because it's an efficiency issue for us where we can focus our money and our time. We know we have moose on the plateau. We don't know how many. And and even where specifically they're located most commonly. So I wouldn't even hazard to guess.
So that answers another question on whether there are moose on the plateau tagged or monitored.
Yeah, you know, if there's a moose that gets to the plateau that has an ear tag, it is probably not one of ours originally. It probably got tagged in Massachusetts. I don't believe they're doing any active tagging. The closest tags that we would have are north of Saranac Lake.
So are there any inoculations you give to moose to reduce parasite risk?
No, unfortunately, there's not. I mean, likely there could be. You know, brainworm is a parasite that is common for goats and sheep, other livestock, and so many folks use ivermectin as a treatment for their livestock, and it would be equally effective, I suspect, in moose. But as a reasonable treatment for wildlife, it just wouldn't work. Just practically speaking, wouldn't be functional. There wouldn't be any way to treat them all in a way that would be impactful.
So the next question is not specifically related to bear and moose, but someone is asking if there are any mountain lions on the plateau or whether that is just legendary.
That is a fun question. And actually, I was forewarned that question might come up. And it comes up almost in every public meeting, surprisingly. So here's the answer. If you'd asked me that 15 years ago, I'd have said, no way. And it is interesting that there is a desire of people to want to say that they've seen a mountain lion or to believe they've seen a mountain lion. And the closest existing mountain lion population to New York is, I think right now, in about Illinois or Missouri. And so we don't believe there are any wild mountain lions in New York presently, or New England, or in any of the states nearby. But here's why I say I would have said absolutely 15 years ago, but I hesitate now. So I don't remember what it was, 2011 maybe, there was a mountain lion in New York. It was observed near Lake George, and we had physical evidence of the mountain lion. And then it ended up getting killed by a car in Connecticut. And that mountain lion, of course, as all animals do, leaves evidence, right? It leaves tracks, scat, hair, and maybe even kills from predating on deer or such. And so there's evidence of its presence. They don't float. And so that animal, the DNA from that dead roadkill mountain lion in Connecticut traced back to a source population in South Dakota. That animal traveled all the way across the northern Midwest, across southern Canada, looped down through along the Lake George side of New York, and passed through into Connecticut to where it finally got hit by a car. And it left evidence all the way along. And every state that had not seen mountain lions, or province that had not seen mountain lions before, was getting the same phone calls that we were, and was able to monitor, or rather discover the evidence. And so we do take sightings seriously when they can be, when they seem plausible. However, it's exceedingly rare for a sighting of a mountain lion to be plausible. In every other case. So we did have, 1993, we did have another case of a mountain lion, which was a released pet. And so it is not impossible for somebody to get a mountain lion kit on the black market or from a legal sale somewhere else, and then hold it illegally in New York and release it. And so that happened in 93 up in the Adirondacks somewhere. I believe it was near Lake Placid. We had a documented case of that. And so there's a couple different ways, either through natural movement or illegal movement. But almost all the sightings of mountain lions are fisher, coyote, house cat, bobcat, everything but. And so what we often do is encourage folks to take a cardboard cutout of a mountain lion out to that site, take a picture where you saw the animal, and you'll see that they are huge animals compared to what you might see. So long answer to a short question. we don't believe we have any mountains in Rensselaer County right now.
All right. Back to the moose.
All right, very good.
Does road density and development limit range expansion due to moose mortality?
So presumably it would. However, our moose density is pretty low, and they're generally concentrated in areas where road densities are also very low. And our best habitats for moose in New York are also in areas where road densities are pretty low. And so I don't expect that road densities in the eastern portion of the Adirondacks or southern portion of the Adirondacks are going to become limiting factors before some of the habitat constraints and the physiological constraints are going to be for moose. We do, because we've had GPS collars on moose, we are able to see their movements relative to roads. And so there are a few, heavily traveled roads in the area, I should say relatively heavily traveled, in the area where our moose are most concentrated. And you can see their regular movement back and forth across those roads. Right now, we are also monitoring vehicle collisions with moose over time. How many mortalities do we have? And mortality from vehicle collisions does not seem to be a limiting factor on population. So I don't think it's going to be such an issue for us. It may be in other areas, but we're not at that density yet that it's a concern.
Well, as of now, there are no more questions in the chat, but there are a lot of people talking about their experiences with bear and even moose on the plateau, which is exciting.
Very good. I wish we were in person and we could share these stories together. One of the things I really appreciate about opportunity to speak with groups like yours is to share those stories. And I'd like tips on where I can go hiking to find moose in Rensselaer Plateau as well.
If there are no further questions, I think we might then wrap up for the night. Thank you, Jeremy. This was very informative, and I know we all appreciated it. So
glad to. Oh, and I'll put another plug in for Dan Bogan. He's fantastic. He's a Plateau resident and knows a lot about coyotes.
All right, so with that, everyone, good night. And I hope you all have a chance to get out on the plateau relatively soon and maybe even see some bear and moose signs.
Very good. Thank you, everyone.